Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today on this swelteringly hot day. My name is Ryan Henson. I lead the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by the Right Honourable Tobias Ellwood, Member of Parliament for Bournemouth East, a former Minister in the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence, and now Chair of the House of Commons Defence Committee. Tobias, welcome, and thank you very much for being with us.
Delighted to join you this afternoon. Really pleased to be here.
I'm going to jump straight in because we only have an hour, and I know there are lots of eager attendees who wish to ask our guest questions. But before I do, for members of our audience, please put your questions to Tobias into the chat. And when we get to the audience Q&A, I will come to you so that you can ask your question on screen. If you would rather not ask your question on screen because you're just too hot or there are Wi-Fi issues, that's fine. Just maybe indicate that in the chat and I will ask it for you. So without any further ado, Tobias, you voted in favour of a return to the 0.7% aid target last week. What impact do you think the aid cuts will have on the Global Britain agenda?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one which has been asked up and down the country. What has been fascinating is seeing perhaps the change in attitude towards how our aid spending goes about. I think YouGov did a poll on this, and it showed that a number of months ago, I think 60% of the nation were in favour of reducing that aid spend from 0.7 to 0.5. But a recent poll was done only a couple of weeks ago, and that changed to just over 50%. And that's because I think people are having a better understanding as to the fact that our aid spend equals our soft power. And our soft power sits with our hard power, and that gives us our influence. And if you reduce our soft power, hard power alone will not work. And a great example of that, and I think we may talk about it a bit later, is Afghanistan, where you're not going to be able to beat the insurgents by military means alone. But there's a bigger concern here for me about this reduction, because this is actually something that we're very good at in the UK. And perhaps that's not perhaps so pronounced as much as we should, make it. We should celebrate it more. Is the fact that the reason why we are so influential across the world is thanks to our reach, our understanding, our desire to come out with solutions, and then lead those solutions by getting others to join us, using our programs to affect change. And well-spent aid actually serves its own purpose. It improves governance. It increases education, it advances communities. And when you withdraw those programs, I'm afraid it does lead to operational changes. Medical clinics which are closed will lead, I'm afraid, to people dying. Fewer girls getting educated, more children will grow hungry, and very sadly, more boys and girls will become slaves. So operationally, this reduction in this amount of money will affect our programs on the ground. Reputationally, it will hit us because, as I say, this is what we are seen around the world as doing something very, very well. And most worryingly, I suppose, is that when these programs are reduced, we leave a vacuum. And that's sometimes exploited by extremists. In places like Somalia, Al-Shabaab will be delighted that we're pulling our programs. Or indeed in places like Libya and other areas across Africa, it'll be Russia and China filling that vacuum when, of course, they actually pursue very, very different soft power agendas than we do.
Thank you. I wonder if I can just pick up on that point, that last point you made, Tobias, about China. How do you think the aid cuts will affect the UK's ability to handle the challenge from China? And I'm sure we'll come on to that challenge a bit more broadly in a bit, but specifically that vacuum that you talk about.
Yeah, I mean, this is really, really interesting. I mean, you introduced me as the chair of the Defence Select Committee. I mean, just stepping back from the issue of soft power itself, I genuinely am concerned about the trajectory of where our world is going. It's a question that I've asked the Prime Minister, the National Security Advisor, our Defence Secretary. Will you feel safer over the next 5 years, or will you feel more insecure because of where global stability is going? And everybody that asked, and I can pose this to the audience here today, all say that they are concerned about the trajectory of global stability. Now, if that is the case, and we see this with growing complex threats, lack of international leadership, major powers rearming, international institutions unable to hold errant nations to account, you then have to ask yourself which nations are willing to step forward, as we've done in the past, and lead others to find those solutions. And that's exactly what I think Britain should be doing. It's part of our DNA. And to some degree, that's what we are trying to do with the G7 summit, is getting people to recognize what those threats are. Now, you mentioned China specifically. I don't think China is looking for a direct military engagement, but we are seeing a new form of Cold War develop, and that's over soft power. I touched on it before. They're advancing their One Belt, One Road programs, their gifting of technology, their gifting of military equipment as well, to countries across the world. And our world, over the next couple of decades, is actually splintering to two spheres of geopolitical conflict. And we on the one side, the West, which is shrinking, and China's influence, which is growing. And we've got a few years to actually, I think, determine how the next few decades play out. And that's why we need to up our game.
I want to turn now to the recently published Integrated Defence Review and just pick up on something you just said about soft power and how that fits in. Can I ask how you think hard power and soft power are combined in the Integrated Review, and whether you think there was sufficient emphasis on the role of soft power?
Well, the Integrated Review was fascinating, I think, and correct in recognizing the changing character of conflict. Yes, of course, you get direct on direct military engagement, as I touched on, but there's a lot of things happening beneath the threshold of direct war. So you can affect somebody's economy through cyber and so forth, through interference with satellites, and we have to protect ourselves. So much of the Integrated Review showed a pivot towards these new areas of concern. It did come, I'm afraid, with a hit because the budget was kept to, didn't really change, to our army capabilities. So our land vehicles and so forth, we're having huge cuts across there from the surface fleet. Our ships are being reduced as well. And it did even in the RAF, where instead of buying 138 F-35s, we're only buying 48 of them. That's hardly enough to fill 2 aircraft carriers. So I have a concern from the hard power perspective, but your question was about soft power. Whenever we go into areas, let's just look back at some of the engagements we've been in. Iraq, Afghanistan, Mali, we're there now. Our military are designed to create an umbrella of security for which activity then must happen to be able to make sure that there's enduring peace. And for too often, we've won the war, but lost the peace. And the best example of that certainly is Afghanistan, but it's right across the world, that is what's happening. The two must work side by side. So as soon as there is enough of a peaceful atmosphere, we need leadership to go in there to start building local governance, building local infrastructure, building local economic opportunity. And that requires not just the DFID type work, but also the private sector and indeed the third sector as well. All a grand strategy building on the work that the military does. Too often the military go in there, do their piece, and then they twiddle their thumbs waiting for something else to happen, which doesn't. And then the enemy regroups, comes back in, and your window of opportunity is lost.
We will come back to Afghanistan, I'm sure, particularly in the audience Q&A. Do you think that the West has become increasingly risk averse when acting on the international stage over the past few years? And I'm thinking about President Trump, but even before that. And if you do, can I ask why you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely the case. And I've talked about the threats that are growing. At the same time, I absolutely agree with you that the West has become risk averse. You know, what do we believe in? What do we stand for? What are we willing to defend? What are those red lines that should not be crossed? Now, when you mention red lines, we often think of Syria. And to remember those, the clarion calls to say, you know, we will attack, you know, we will not allow the chemical weapons to be used. And President Obama, you know, hesitated. We hesitated. I remember the vote here in the House of Commons. And that was just the green light for Russia to then to move in in scale in Syria, a country they were always very close to, but they realized that the West were not going to work together. And it's the absence of us standing together, which means that it's actually very difficult to stand up to China that's interpreting our global order to its own benefit. Australia dared to challenge China to say we need an international investigation as to work out what happened at the start of COVID-19. And China's response was to slap tariffs on agricultural products. Where was the rest of the international community support? Is absolutely the right call. We were not there together. And if there's a difference between this sort of Cold War, if that's where we're going, which is going to be a bun fight, as I say, over soft power, and the last one is the fact that China's Achilles heel is trade. For it to advance, it must continue developing trade links across the world to fuel its very needy economy. Russia was very independent. It was self-sustaining. And maybe that's the big difference as well, is because nobody is quite sure what to make of China. We were hoping it would mature into a global responsible citizen, adapt democratic standards and values. With Russia, it was very, very clear. It was a single entity, an ideology that threatened us. So the West were as one in how to respond, not least because there was NATO that brought countries together. But we are so divided on what to do about China.
And can I ask, how much of that do you think stems from the legacy of Iraq? And I'm thinking of, I'm sure many of us are familiar with Samantha Power's work over the years, and she talks about being in the White House at the time of that Syria vote, because I understand there was obviously similar discussion happening in the US, and she talks about how, her gut instinct was to intervene. She'd been in Kosovo years before. She knew the price of non-intervention, and yet, they made the call that they did in the end, which was similar to our own. Do you think the sort of impact of Iraq, the legacy of Iraq, is still being felt, or is it more a lack of appetite at an elite political level?
I think you're absolutely right. I think we're haunted by our engagements in Iraq and Afghanistan. I feel it here in the House of Commons, where colleagues are hesitant to put boots on the ground in other localities. Yemen is a country that we are the UN penholder for. We ran half the country for a long time. They gained their independence from us. We could easily influence an outcome to that terrible war that's taking place there, that forgotten war. We don't utilize our influence, partly because it would require a stabilization force going in there, and there isn't the appetite to send in boots on the ground. We've lost the confidence, if you like, firstly, to have a grand plan as to how to get ourselves out, going back to the utility of soft and hard power, but also simply because there's no political appetite. And the concern about that, again, I emphasize, is the fact that when you leave vacuums like that, such as in Syria and Iraq, it's actually another adversary, competitor, in this case Russia, that takes advantage of that.
Let's turn now then to Afghanistan. This is a really big, broad question, but what do you think can be learnt from Britain's involvement in Afghanistan over the past 20 years?
Well, it isn't just the past 20 years, it's Afghan history that we should understand. We shouldn't have ventured back there until we'd fully read up on our three previous engagements. Afghanistan got its independence from us, and we had this policy of, it was called butcher and bolt, back in the 1830s, where we would go in and butcher many of the locals and then bolt back out again in order to try, because we couldn't actually control the country at all. It could not be run because it was so diverse from a tribal perspective. It was part of that great game between Russia above the Oxus River and between India, as it then was, and the Indus River. And we didn't learn from our history to understand just how complex the country is. So we came in 2001, because of the Taliban's relationship with Al-Qaeda, imposing a Western structure run from Kabul. Now, in all of Afghan history, there's been a strong leader in Kabul, from Dost Mohammed, for example, to the king himself. But you've always had tribal structures where decision-making was done on a local basis. So who are we to come in and impose Karzai and a Western standards and values on a country that had never appreciated or utilized them? And that was just one of many mistakes. We then, the Taliban wanted to actually come to the table. There was a massive Shura Council, if you like, in Bonn, as it then was, just to work out where the country was going to go, make a draft constitution. The Taliban requested to be at the table. And Donald Rumsfeld said, no, we're the winners here. We'll choose who turns up. How different life would have been had we invited them to participate then. And then the other major schoolboy error was over 5 years, we did not invest in an indigenous security capability. We didn't start building the army and the police until 2005 and 6. By that time, the Taliban had retreated across Pakistan's border, regrouped, rearmed, retrained, then came back, and that's when it all started going downhill. And today, they are advancing at a incredible rate of knots, and I really do fear for another civil war.
We will come back to Afghanistan, I'm certain, in the audience Q&A. But before I open it up, I want to just finish by going back to where we started with a few questions on global Britain. You recently discussed the need for increased bandwidth in Whitehall for tackling international and foreign policy. And I think I'm right in saying that you've suggested introducing a deputy PM responsible for coordinating the global Britain agenda. Could you expand a bit more on that idea?
Yeah, certainly. If you think of the two big plates that spin that have dominated Whitehall over the last decade, it's certainly been Brexit that's just taken up all the airtime. It really has, in every department, and has kept our heads down. And a lot of the world's experienced a few revolutions during that time where Britain could have done more on the global stage, but we've been busy dealing with the prospect of Brexit. And then the second one, of course, is COVID-19, where again, just like many other countries, having to deal with economic fallout, the health of the nation and so forth. And it's exposed the tried and tested, but rather siloed approach to decision-making in Whitehall. And my concern is if we're genuine about global Britain, if we're sincere about taking a more elevated, advanced and responsible role on the international stage, you can't do it under the current construct. You need to adapt a more proactive approach with additional leadership, greater bandwidth, as you say. And that's where a new position of a deputy prime minister responsible for foreign policy, for our aid policy, soft and hard power, with our trade policy as well, to actually coordinate those activities and have that internationalist responsibility separate to the prime minister that would have oversight, but be able to focus on domestic matters. And that, I think, would work very, very well and allow us to better coordinate what these big internationalist departments are doing, but even today still work slightly either in competition or certainly out of sync with each other.
I think that's really interesting. I'm thinking of President Biden when he was vice president, and he very much played a similar role, you could argue, for President Obama, in that there was the Secretary of State who handled foreign policy, but there was this big heavyweight figure who was a deputy to the president who could have those conversations. That's very interesting to think on. Another question on global Britain. Could you offer some reflections on the G7 summit, which we've just had? And we spent lots of time building up to it. It was a key staging post, of course, in the global Britain agenda. Could you tell us what you think was successful and what you think, what else may have been achieved or is still left to do?
Yeah, it was a real opportunity to regroup for the West, as we just spoke about, to get together and face up to the complex challenges that we face. I said that the trajectory is not good, that over the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to get very, very bumpy. Indeed, I argue it's more dangerous though different than during the Cold War. So what are we going to do about it? With increasing authoritarianism, with extremism still growing, climate change, another huge challenge for the world that the nation, all the nations need to work together if we're going to handle this. And the G7 was a real wake-up call for all these countries to say, my goodness, we must work together. The West must regroup. And of course, that massive challenge of China, and then the more acute problem of a resurgent Russia doing its own thing in Eastern Europe. And it was also an opportunity for the United States, of course, that leads the West, to prove that it itself has moved on from the years under Donald Trump. I think you touched on this, I didn't reply. But clearly that's a retrograde step, what Donald Trump did for the United States. Of putting, this America First policy is all very well looking after yourselves. But if you allow fires to ignite around you, eventually they will affect you. And whether you like it or not, the President of the United States in today's day and age does have a leadership role to play, leading the West in finding solutions and encouraging the world to step forward. So what we saw in the G7 was a massive opportunity to regroup, to start addressing these things. But the response in their communique on China was really interesting, to say, this is a complex matter and we're going to come back to it. That's like saying, yes, I know it's a problem, I'm not quite sure yet. We've yet to have a Sputnik moment, if you like. Sputnik was that satellite that went over the United States. People looked up at it, they could even see it in the night sky, realizing they had fallen behind in the space race, needed to do something about it. And that's where the Apollo program came in. There was the energy of the United States to say, this is a threat. We don't need to match that threat. We need to get ahead of it. We still haven't had that Sputnik moment with China. I'm not saying to defeat China in any way, but it's to reassume ownership of the rules, to say, China, please abide by those rules as we move forward. And that is the biggest challenge for the next decade for the West.
Just want to pick up on the US angle there, because the UK Defence Secretary has been in the United States this week. Have you been broadly impressed by the direction of travel from the new Biden administration? I know you just said that perhaps in the communique with China there was lots that was left unsaid, but broadly, are they moving in the right direction, or are there areas that you're particularly concerned or worried about?
Yeah, it's I mentioned back channels. The relationship between the United States and Britain is fundamental in advancing a Western collective construct together. What we bring to the table, and I mentioned it before, but I absolutely believe in it, is a wise cognitive understanding of the world and a willingness to put forward workable solutions. We don't have the might of the United States, but we certainly have the ability to understand what's going on, and the Americans appreciate that. We are their first port of call to say, what should we do? And then our flag then joins them in pursuing a solution, and then it becomes internationalist because we're working together. That's the entire spirit of the Atlantic Charter. And under Donald Trump, that fell apart. There was no relationship. Mention him just because it happened, but I was in touch with John Kerry this morning. I didn't have that relationship with, and I'm half American. I pride myself on the bonds that I have with the Capitol and on the Hill and so forth. But during the Trump time, that was very, very difficult indeed. They were not interested in working with anybody. It was all about the United States. And that was very, very dangerous indeed. It allowed, as I say, our adversaries to take full advantage of a disorganized West. And we've got some catching up to do.
Just as you mentioned John Kerry, and this will be my last question before I open it up to the audience, thinking ahead to COP26, that other big staging post of global Britain later on this year, do you think that climate change is now seen as a national security issue? International development, foreign aid, people can make that connection for all the reasons you gave in the answer to my first question. Do you think the same will be seen of climate change, or is it still seen as something unrelated to the defence of the UK?
I don't think we're still taking it seriously enough. It's almost like a slow burn issue. We're conscious of it, particularly the younger generation are wanting change. John Kerry's speech yesterday at Kew Gardens emphasized this. All the people in office are not doing enough, to help the next generation. And we are reaching the limits of what our fragile planet can take. And if we don't adjust and adapt in the next couple of years, then there's going to be massive crisis. We've seen some indications of that. I mean, the floods in Germany, the fires in the United States, and then China as well. We've seen some incredible weather conditions now. We need to wake up to say this affects absolutely everybody. And if we don't all adjust, we will all be affected. I don't believe that we still had that, again, that Sputnik moment, if you like, when it comes to climate change. And we can adapt. I mean, the biggest, as John Kerry said himself, which is the most successful car manufacturer now? It's Tesla. And what do they make? It shows that when you put your mind to it, you can actually provide solutions. We've got wind turbines now, that a single wind turbine can provide the power for 45,000 houses. well, why on earth aren't we advancing that and proving that we can get this right? And it's the politicians that need to wake up for that. So the second big event that we're hosting, again, great to see this from a British perspective, is COP26. We're co-hosting that in Glasgow. So important. And this is the challenge perhaps with dealing with China, because of course, challenging their errant behavior is tricky when you want to keep them on board to sign up, because they're one of the world's biggest polluters as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Right. I will now open it up to questions from the audience. And as I've mentioned at the beginning, I'll read the name, and then hopefully the member of the audience with the question can come on screen and ask the question. So first of all, Rocco Bloom from War Child. If you're there, Rocco, please ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Very good, excellent. The question I wanted to ask was about the implications of the integrated review. As the integrated review recognised, we have multiple security threats that the UK has to address around the world. And that means that we need to work with partners that do not share our values. And the question I have is really, in terms of our military partnerships with, say, the armed forces in Nigeria or Somalia, we know that those armed forces do commit rights violations, and we have an opportunity to steer them in the right direction. So I wanted to ask what you thought the right measures could be for our armed forces to support them to address these violations. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's worth emphasizing that if you don't help countries like Nigeria and Somalia, I know another country that will, and they will not bat an eyelid about those very issues that you've just raised. So we need to stay the course. I just remind those on the call here, what happened after the Second World War? We stayed with Germany. We're still in Germany today, militarily. And look where Germany has gone. We didn't pack up and disappear after the Second World War and say, right, that's it, we're going home. We were there to nurture this country into what it is today, a massive economic powerhouse, supportive of our democratic structures. More so than that, it participates in furthering our international values. And that's all because, we invested decades of energy to do that. Imagine if we had pulled out, where would what would have happened to East Germany would probably have happened to West Germany. The Iron Curtain would be in a very, very different position during that period of time, right up against France as well. And it would have absolutely destroyed any form of European cooperation, unlikely to have seen the formation of the European Union. How history would have been so different. Here we are in Afghanistan pulling out. The same could apply there. This is a bit of real estate that's so important next to India, Russia, China, and so on. If we could nurture that, or could have nurtured that, into a moderate Muslim, democratically leading country as a I think as an indicator as to where we could go, that would have been something very special. And the two countries you mentioned, Nigeria and Somalia as well, easily possible to do something similar on a smaller scale with less energy, but you need to have that enduring commitment. You need to have the imposition of the soft power and the hard power plans. When it comes to Nigeria, it's one of the richest countries in the world. I visited it, and the amount of oil that spilled out into the Gulf of Mexico. Do you remember the BP issue that when that happens every year in the Delta of Nigeria, because of all the leaks that people are stealing, locals are stealing oil from the pipelines that go out to sea, and fires take place every day. The entire area is contaminated. DFID programs actually help the local communities because the wells are all poisoned. But we don't go to the source of the problem, which is actually having a program that allows that oil to be properly fixed, sold, and then use that money to actually help the locals. There's a plan there that could be done, but it requires a strategy. And then Boko Haram is in the north of the country as well. That's not resolved. You need greater effort. Somalia is a similar place there, where there is we scratch the surface of what we do because we feel the need to do it. But you saw with, if you've seen that film Black Hawk Down, I mean, a great example about when one big event comes out, that's it, index, let's pull out. And you need greater commitment. That's what we need here. And the stakes are high now because, as I say, there's other countries that are lining up to take our place.
I think the link with or your reference to Germany is very interesting. I spoke to a friend of mine who teaches British history, and we were talking about the aid cuts, and he said, you know, after the Second World War, the UK faced rationing, while at the same time sending economic resources to support a country that we'd been at war with just a few years before. So it's fascinating that not just the sacrifices that the British people were willing to make, but that ability to see the bigger picture, or at least for their politicians to make sure that message got through. Our next question is from Pauline D'Souza from the Diversity Art Forum. Pauline, if you're there, this is your moment. Otherwise, I will read your question because I have it here. Give it 5 seconds. Otherwise, I will leap straight in. So Pauline's question is, does the UK have a healthy budget for an increased need for data science to match the UK defence agenda? And is there space for financial growth in a data science budget?
My short answer would be yes. One of the other indicators of the integrated review is the desire for Britain to become a science superpower. And I think this is commendable. We have to, one of the purposes of the integrated review is actually work out who you are in the world, what you want to do, what you want to achieve. And then you also need to, do a stock check on the threats. And then the final part of it is how should your defense posture then change? And I think the whole data science world is absolutely an incredible area of growth and a huge opportunity for Britain to make its mark. We're already leader in aerospace. We're already leading in from a satellite and space capability as well. It's natural for us to then want to try and I think dominate this space. I'll be honest, I'm only learning about it now from a military context and so forth, but from a vulnerability perspective, I'll make it very, very clear. The area of concern I have more than others is how we're affected by changing technologies. If you think every time you use a credit card to buy a Starbucks cup of coffee, that involves 3 satellites, GPS satellites. Now, if those were taken out, for example, our entire world of communications and be able to go about our daily lives would change fundamentally. So protecting our space assets, protecting our cyber capabilities, we become ever more reliant, is absolutely critical. And I'm really pleased to see that through our cyber security initiatives and so forth and understanding of data science, we're getting better and better at it. Without putting too much emphasis on it, there is a race now to harness quantum computing. Whoever does that will get a real lead shot on everybody else because you multiply by 100 the speed in which you can do calculations. And if China gets there first, well, who knows where they'll take that particular asset.
I want to introduce Tim Morris now, who has a question. Tim.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi there, Mr. Ellwood. It's great to see you. I was ambassador in South Sudan some years ago, and I'm afraid I just missed you when you came on your visit. I was out of the country. It's a question about Africa. I think we all understand that the integrated review didn't really concentrate on Africa, as it was more about defense and more about the tilt to the Indo-Pacific. But as you know, there was an Africa strategy, or at least a so-called Africa strategy, which was introduced by the government in 2018. But I think many of us are still really wondering what the core approach of the government and indeed the country is to Africa looking to the future. So it'd just be very interesting to hear your views about the continent.
Yeah, Tim, were you there when I came out for the signing of the South Sudan end of the Civil War. Were you ambassador then?
Which one is the question? You came out, I think, when you were Ministry of Defence. That's what I remember.
Right. Okay. No, I remember coming out there, and the two warring sides in South Sudan finally came together. They got their independence from Sudan itself, and then they couldn't agree, the two sides, as to what to do. And they eventually signed a deal, but one of them refused to sign the document for 24 hours. So I was stuck in the Hilton Hotel with a young American member of the State Department, a name called Tony Blinken, who was quite interesting to play cards with for a long period of time. There was no internet over there.
Glad you got benefit from it.
But it shows how these connections sort of help.
Yeah.
I mean, South Sudan is a great example of a country, again, where Britain could leverage its connectivity and so forth, and perhaps should do more. Again, goes back to the bandwidth point as well. I don't think there needs to be an Africa strategy. I think there needs to be sub parts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, Sahara strategy. There's the northern countries, which are North African countries, are often teed up with the Arab world as well. There's down in South Africa too. There's different parts where certainly we can pursue incredible agendas, but there needs to be the will. There needs to be, having a second defense attaché in any of these locations would help advance the security relationship. I served out in Kenya, for example, and to hear that the World Service has now left Kenya. They were supporting the Kenya state media and have now had to pack up because China has replaced them. Now, how long will it be until our military support to Kenya is also withdrawn, because we've not bothered to compete with China on that front as well? They've just signed a massive One Belt, One Road program, where the deal was signed using Chinese law, not even Kenyan law. I mean, what is happening on the continent of Africa? We need to understand. 1/4 of the world's population will soon come from Africa. They have 1/5 of the jobs available for that population. Where are all those people going to go? We've got a few dinghies turning up on Dover. Just wait until climate change and population growth really hits Africa.
Want to bring in someone else who speaks with great authority on these topics, who you will know very well, Tobias, I'm sure. Alistair Burt, if you're there, Alistair, great.
Hi, Tobias, good to see you. Looking well as always. At least I don't have to be in a suit today, so there is some benefit to being outside. It's great to see you. I wanted to just to pick your brains on Afghanistan as well. I share your reservations, as I share many of the reservations you've spoken with just now. But what practical alternatives were there to staying there, bearing in mind the situation? How long could we have stayed there with the situation being as difficult as it was? I'm particularly concerned about the impact on women's rights. In particular, you will know great parliamentarians like Fawzia Kofi, as I do, who tweets frequently, and she must be a great risk. I also wondered, because of near neighbours, China and Iran won't want to see insurrection in Afghanistan. Can they be of any assistance in stability, though it's galling to be in a position to ask them to do that? If that's the case, what prospects can you see for development NGOs from the UK and the West still being able to work there in the new circumstances? But really good to see you, looking well.
Alistair, great to hear from you as well, and hope you're surviving. I know you had a bit of an operation, and so I hope you're got all that behind you, and also pay tribute to the huge amount of work that you did in this space as well. Really good questions. My view is that you did need commitment. We couldn't have done it without the United States, and we missed an opportunity under Joe Biden when he was hinting at pulling out, calling it a forever war. Why is it forever? It's forever because we've not, provided the perhaps the solutions that we should have. And I spoke about two of them. But ultimately, our presence gave legitimacy to the current Afghan authority, and that's now disappeared. And that's why the Taliban is on the forefront. We know Pakistan well. You know Pakistan well. We could have done a lot more with the country to persuade them that this bun fight that they're having with India, which then spilled over to the quarrel in Afghanistan, could have been resolved. You probably said the same lines that I have.
I'm sure I did.
In debates about India and Pakistan, oh, we hope the two countries come together and resolve their issues. If you've got two children who fight, you don't use those lines. Oh, I hope you two can go away, behind a tree somewhere and sort out your differences. That doesn't work. It requires a third party to take some form of leadership incentive and stay with them. And I gave the example of Germany of staying the course. What was happening at the moment was a bit of a stalemate. There's no doubt about it. But we were just starting over the last couple of years to get in the position where the Taliban were not on the front foot. There were discussions actually taking place. And you needed a tribal structure, in my view, similar to the United Arab Emirates, where you have different kingdoms, and the same way we had in the UK. We had a number of kingdoms, from Sussex, Wessex, Anglia, and so forth, each having their own reputation, their own sort of spirit, if you like. The United States, you go to Utah, it's very different to Texas or to Maine. Now, Afghanistan, as I know you know, is not too dissimilar. Herat is very close to Iran in language, in the trade. There's a railway line that links the two. Mazar-e-Sharif is much, much closer to the Stans in the north. And the Pashtun belt clearly links more towards the Pakistani border and so forth. There's ways that we could have devised a structure which could have allowed an avenue, a long-term avenue. But basically, we didn't do enough. I remember landing in Marja in the middle of the Helmand desert with General Jim Mattis, and he just blitzed the area of all the Taliban. And both of us asked all the NGOs, DFID, the head of DFID, I think it was one of the top DFID advisors who'd come to the country as well. I said, when's the road going to be tarmacked? When are you going to do all these things? Oh, now that it's been liberated, we can get to work on that. There was no plan between the military and the soft power coming in behind it. So all sorts of things we could do differently. But I'm afraid that ship may have sailed.
I'd now like to bring in Danny Sri Skandaraja, the Chief Executive of Oxfam. Danny, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Ryan. Thank you, Tobias. And I should say, whenever I hear you, I can't help but think you're one of the most sort of articulate and credible champions of an internationalist Britain. So thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
Just in terms of, you might expect this coming from a sort of aid organization, but what more do you think the likes of us at Oxfam and then the sort of broader development sector can do to not necessarily sort of win the argument on point 7 or on the sort of narrow question, but the broader question around how do we rebuild that compassionate sort of center ground? Because like you, I'm optimistic. We saw some data in the charity sector just the other day that in the last sort of 12 months, the proportion of the British people giving to all charities has increased, including doubling to international development charities. So, Ryan, like your point around, what happened immediately after the Second World War, we are seeing levels of compassion amongst the British public. But, is there more that you would like to see our sector do to further that? Thanks.
That's a really good question. And it's important that those that were like-minded, very kind words you said at the beginning, all push in the same direction. Alistair will recall that when the start of DFID came about, there were some very spurious programs where money went to, dancing girls in Algeria. They should never have received it. There are countries with space programs that the taxpayer is saying, why on earth are we spending that money? They don't understand, quite rightly, how that money might be put to good use, or maybe shouldn't have got them there in the first place. I speak about soft power now as much as I do about aid, humanitarian support, and the consequences of actually pulling out. You may not like my full reply though, but I can't help thinking that the 0.7%, the rules on spending that money needs to be updated. Okay, so these ODA rules created by the OECD, based in Paris, came about after the Second World War, and the world is very, very different now. If our military go out to support Caribbean countries after a hurricane, you could argue that that is, aid money could be spent from that. And that may be technically a bit difficult for the likes of your good selves, NGOs, to stomach. But if you did it, if you just relinquished a little bit from being, so firm on some of those rules, we'd win over more of the British public, which means that we would retain the 0.7% and be able to do other activities. I'm part of something called 77 Brigade in the British Army. They are post-conflict capability. They come in, we still have a gun on our side just in case things get a little bit fruity, but we can work in difficult environments to the point where we can then hand over to you guys and keep the whole reconstruction process going after the war fighting has stopped. And we keep forgetting, we lose the muscle memory of actually how you do stabilization. And so, as I said, you may not like my reply, but I just think there's some technical issues that we need to do to convince the taxpayer that what we're doing is the right call.
Right, James Cowan, Chief Executive of the Halo Trust. James, over to you.
Hi, Tobias. I think I'm probably the only CEO of an NGO who has an ex-military background. I think of strategy in its old sense, which is the alignment of policy objectives with military and civilian ways and means. I attend Bond, I listen to the other NGOs. There is never any discussion with the military end of our world. And I also go to see my ex-military colleagues, and there's never any discussion of the development sector. It's like two different tribes. In the 1930s, Basil Littlehart wrote a book called The British Way in Warfare. Do we need a new British way in conflict? And how would you articulate that approach to conflict that is more subtle, it integrates soft and hard power in the national interest?
I would 100% agree with that, and it needs to be looked into and then articulated. It goes back to the will of making it want to happen. Is this something that number 10 would want to buy into? And I'm absolutely there with you. I'd love to run that myself. I'd like to write that policy myself. I'll be frank with you. I just don't feel, going back to the bandwidth issue, that this is a concern. The argument of the 0.7% to 0.5% was about telling the red wall seats up in the north of England, we're going to give more money to you because you're more important to us. And that's the sell. Now, once you said it, it's very difficult to undo, let alone the problems of the fact that once you've done that and you pull your support for programs, you're going to cause issues which will then come to our doorstep. All those boats that are turning up today, arresting migrants and so forth, is that going to change? They'll be quite happy if they've come from Afghanistan to spend a couple of years in jail, because it'll be safer than where they've come from. And then they apply for asylum because they can't go back. And we should be spending more effort at source to deal with these problems. That doesn't mean us doing the heavy lifting, but it does mean us doing the heavy thinking and providing the thought leadership that shows commitment and longevity, working with good people like your good selves as well. So I think there's absolutely some homework to be done on that front. If I may, Ryan, just take advantage and ask James, what are you going to do in Afghanistan? James runs an incredible outfit of demining. Can I just ask, take an opportunity to say, how are you impacted by the West, the US, UK leaving?
Yeah, thanks, Tobias. Well, we have already been impacted. On the 8th of June, a group of armed men broke into one of our camps and murdered 10 of my people, and an 11th died of his wounds. After it, ISIS condemned it. We are, in fact, an organization that is acceptable to the Taliban. So what I want to see is a post-NATO strategy that involves soft power, the use of the organizations such as the Halo Trust to leverage a responsible Taliban, either because it is in opposition or in coalition or in government. And I believe the Taliban is beginning to talk in a responsible way. as all military men, I believe that all wars come to an end through negotiation. Northern Ireland, Malaya, anywhere else you care to mention. And that we should think strategically about how tools at our disposal, such as Halo, can be utilized. I simply see no sophisticated thinking along those lines being applied at the moment. And I think it's a real shame.
Thank you, James. Our next question comes from Kate Eastman at CAFOD. And Kate asks, do you think that the UK's pivot of focus to Asia is in the UK's interest, or should we be focusing our efforts on relationships closer to home?
Yeah, well, it's another good, very topical question, given where the world is going. The integrated review demands that we pivot to Asia for two reasons. One, because the economic opportunity that's opening up, there's no doubt about it. The markets are quite incredible. And it's right that we then tap into that. And then also because of the duality of China gobbling up its influence, and therefore, the aircraft carrier moving across to the South China Sea, very important if we want to remain a global player and retain that seat on the UN Security Council, that we remain interested in these, active from that perspective as well. It then begs the question, which is a theme I think that's come out across here, is our hard power large enough to be able to do that? We have 6 Type 45s at the moment, and for one reason or another, just one of them is working right now. All the rest of them have got big problems. They are not able to function. And that one that's working, HMS Diamond, is currently with our carrier group, but we can't muster a full carrier group fleet. We've had to call some allies and say, can you help protect our Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier, because we can't do it ourselves. And that gives an indication. There's some tough questions for the UK to recognize, where do we go the next sort of 10 years. I believe firmly that given that the soft power war that I spoke of, we don't need exquisite kit completely. You do need it in some cases. 6 destroyers is fine, but you need more basic vessels, basic aircraft, just to show presence, just to fly the British flag, and like pawns on a chessboard, just to help dominate. If they bump into trouble, then you send in a bigger piece to support. What we've got is, from a tank to an aircraft to a ship, they're all worth billions, and we haven't got many of them.
We've got just over 5 minutes left. There's a few more questions, and they're continuing to come in. This one is from Shane. Shane Miley is a Bournemouth East constituent and an international development volunteer. Shane, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much, Ryan. So yes, Tobias, I've wanted to say firstly, I'm very interested in everything you've had to say so far, whether it's been on climate change, China, or the importance of development around the world. I think that it's been really important, and it's crucial that we keep these things in mind going forward. My question is, do you think that right now we're able to maintain the diplomatic strength we need to work with China on issues such as climate change? Or do we lack the capacity to endure increased tension as we go into this new Cold War style scenario? Thank you very much.
Really good question, Shane. And my first point is, can I put a poster up in your back garden during the next election? So I hope coming from Bournemouth East, but you don't need to answer that one. Great question, because that's what's challenging Britain at the moment, given that we're inviting China. And it could be that President Xi comes, he's not ventured outside his country for a while because of COVID. What we need to explain to China, and I think they're picking this up already, is that unless collectively we do make a mark on climate change, we're all going to suffer. The secretive nature of China, I've invested a lot of time to understand China, I have to say. I read about it every day, whether it be Chinese newspapers or indeed other briefings and so forth, the history. We have an awful lot of people that do the talk on China, but they don't understand how we acquired Hong Kong in the first place. They don't understand the century of humiliation or the Opium Wars, or why China is a bit miffed with the West in the first place. The Bretton Woods talks took place after the Second World War. China wasn't invited, and here's us. We spent an awful lot of time in the Industrial Revolution poisoning our skies. Now China wants to have their turn, and they're saying, well, why should you get to do it 200 years ago, but we can't do it now? The issue, I think, is that if we don't all step forward, particularly China, because it's building a coal power station almost every week, then the scale of demise is going to be huge. And some of the scenes you probably witnessed on Twitter and so forth of the underground stations in China show really how serious the Chinese need to take it. They've actually embraced the green revolution hugely, but that's partly because they're very economically astute. They know what's coming around the corner and what widget it is to make and to dominate, and they've done very, very well on that. So this is a fine line to walk of challenging China when it comes to trade, when it comes to the military dominance, South China Sea and so forth, but also leaving the door open to make sure that we can advance a climate change strategy.
Thank you, Tobias. And I think our last question will be asked on a very similar theme. China is proving to be a very popular topic, but this one's interesting. It's on values. Can I ask Sam Slaughter-Newsom to speak? Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Mr. Ellwood, thanks so much for your candid and insightful reflections and analysis. And you've spoken a lot about ceding ground to China, which is clearly a really big question. I'd be really interested to know how much you think we should be prepared to flex on the sort of current international rules-based system, which is built on Western values, in order to bring China in rather than push China out. So where do you see that balance being?
I hope it's not a case of pushing China out, because they've got so large, so incredibly powerful and confident now. We saw that over COVID. Their conduct over COVID is such that they've become very, very bullish indeed. But the West does need to regroup. My answer to that is a bolstered G7. So if you add Australia, Korea, and India to the G7, you get over half the world's GDP. That's not a bad starting point to say, let's reestablish some up-to-date trade and security standards and values, for which we then invite other nations to join and support. So the EU could easily participate in that. That would take up much of Europe. The Pan-American countries the same, and some of the Asian countries could join in as well. And when you have those standard set of rules, which would include tariffs on carbon tax and so forth, you then have a new international order from which you can move forward. But it can only work if people are committed to joining in. Same way that sanctions can only work if all countries then abide by them. If any nation receiving sanctions is able to find an avenue to sell oil, as Iran does to China, what's the point of having the sanctions there in the first place? So for me, it's a bolstered G10 working together, which you then take to G20 or to other organizations, institutions, to say, this is the reset. Go back the other way, from G10 to G7, you go back to the Atlantic Charter, United States and the UK. And that, for me, is the biggest challenge and would be the biggest opportunity for global Britain to lead on this.
Tobias, thank you very much. We have 30 seconds left, so we'll end it there. You've been incredibly generous with your time, and I'm really grateful to you. Thank you so much. You've reassured us, for those of us working in this field. You've also challenged us, and you've given us lots to reflect on. I'm really grateful to our audience. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your questions. A quick plug, we are doing an event on Tuesday afternoon next week at the Coalition for Global Prosperity on freedom of religion and belief. It'll be a fantastic event. You can find details on our website. And that's it. Thank you all so much. Tobias, thank you again, and have an excellent afternoon.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.